In June of 1972, several burglars were caught breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. They were arrested and charged, and then in the ensuing months, it became clear that they were working under the auspices of something that is referred to as the Plumbers Unit of the White House. Nixon got through the 1972 election without very much being identified with this break-in. From January 1973 until August of 1974, there were a series of revelations and bombshells that started to consume the Nixon presidency. And then it culminated in the resignation in the summer of 1974.
I have always tried to do what was best for the nation.
The question of whether to bring a president or a former president to justice was laying out there in Washington for somebody to take and put up on his back. Ford had this tremendous need to get past this, and he did it in the only way that he knew how, settle it on his own. Courageous, but also very costly. Gerald Ford was born Leslie King Jr. His parents fell out almost immediately. By the time that Ford was a year old, his father had sued his mother for divorce, and Ford's mother eventually remarried, and Gerald Ford took his name. The really key piece of his character that was informed from an early age was this notion of trying to make peace between his parents. Leslie King Sr. never paid child support. His mother really needed the money to support him, and this became the consuming issue of Ford's life from the time he was an adolescent. And he tried to bring peace to this domestic dispute by working out a deal between his parents where his father would pay his mother a lump sum and then go away. After World War II, Gerald Ford got out of the Navy and returned home and started practicing law in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He ran for the House and he went to Washington. He represented his constituents well. He represented his party well. He was somebody that everybody felt that they could get along with. Things were not as partisan as they are now. Because of that, he was somebody that the Democrats always felt that they could make a deal with. His dream was to become Speaker of the House. He never saw himself as moving beyond that. He didn't want to be president or vice president. He had no aspiration to climb up into the Senate. The problem was that even with a Republican presidential landslide in 1972, the Republicans still couldn't win the House. When he realized that he would never be Speaker, he was about to retire from politics. And then 10 months into Nixon's second term, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, was forced to resign after he pleaded no contest to tax evasion charges from when he was governor of Maryland. When Agnew resigned, Nixon had to choose his own vice president. He did not want Gerry Ford, but the Democrats in Congress made it clear to him that nobody else would be acceptable. By that time, the judicial branch and the legislative branch were already looking at the larger story of the Watergate break-in. The Democratic majority in Congress was very aware that Nixon might not serve out his term. And the reason that they preferred Gerry Ford is that Ford didn't have presidential aspirations of his own. He thought, if I'm the one person who's acceptable to both parties, then I'll go ahead and do this job. As the investigations advanced, as Nixon dug in harder, I think Ford kept himself in the dark as much as possible. It wasn't as if Ford and Nixon were palling around together. Ford spent as much time as possible outside of Washington because he didn't want to be tainted by Watergate. It became clear that Nixon was going to have to resign when the Supreme Court ruled that he had to hand over the secret tapes. The White House had a taping system in it, an Orwellian system that was on all the time and that recorded everything that everybody said. There was, as they called it, the smoking gun. This was a tape that Nixon basically said to his closest advisors, we have to stop the FBI investigation, use the CIA, do whatever you have to do. When that happened, it was clear to everyone that Nixon had been very involved not only in the direction of the Watergate break-in, but more critically, the cover-up of the Watergate break-in. All three branches of government, the prosecutor, the courts, and Congress, insisted that Nixon step aside. Just as all of this was coming to a head, Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's chief of staff, went to Ford's office with a piece of paper that had been prepared by Nixon's lawyer. The title of it was Permutations for the Option of Resignation. And these were various ways that Nixon could leave office without being prosecuted. The last three involved pardons. The first was that Nixon pardoned himself and leave. The second was that Nixon pardoned everyone who was being investigated for Watergate and leave. And the third was that Gerald Ford would ascend to the presidency and then pardon Richard Nixon. Ford did not agree to that. As he said later on, there was no deal because I didn't accept any deal. But the fact that he had actually considered this raised awareness all around that this was a possibility.
You were here to say goodbye to us.
Ford wasn't in the room when Nixon made his famous farewell speech. In that speech, he didn't admit to any wrongdoing, but he admitted to something even greater, really a kind of a mammoth insight into his own downfall.
Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them.
Nixon goes out in a blaze. He walks out, got on the red carpet, and walked out to the helicopter with Pat, his long-suffering wife, and Gerald Ford and Betty Ford standing beside him. Nixon turned around, and in one of the most enduring images in American presidential history, raises his two hands in V for victory, as he always did, climbs on the helicopter and leaves. Jerry Ford and Betty Ford walk back on the same red carpet. Ford clutches her and says, "We can do this." And he walks inside and he becomes the president of the United States while Nixon's in the air on his way back to California.
The President of the United States.
Gerald Ford was a terrific president for a month. He was open where Nixon was closed. He appeared to be honest where Nixon appeared to be dishonest. He was accessible. He was human. He was warm. His whole approach during this first month was to try to move the country towards the middle. He adopted what somebody else called the mantle of the presidential center, and he was wildly effective at this. He met with the Congressional Black Caucus, which Nixon had refused to do. He met with the Congressional Women, which Nixon had refused to do. And the country was wowed and refreshed and optimistic. And he was very happy about that. He felt that the country was seeing that he was the right guy to put America back on a solid footing and to bring people together again. I don't think any president has ever come to the presidency with as many challenges as Ford faced during his first month in office. The White House was in disarray. The economy was in the worst shape that it had been in since the Great Depression. And then there was a very complex array of international crises that he had to deal with. There was almost a war between Greece and Turkey over Cyprus. So he had a tremendous number of challenges that he had to face simultaneously. He also had to deal, of course, with what was going to happen with Nixon. Nixon's chief aides were about to go to trial. He had been named as an unindicted co-conspirator. The grand jury wanted to indict him. There was clearly a question of whether Nixon could and should be prosecuted. But nobody else in Washington was willing to step forward, not the special prosecutor, not the grand jury, not the Congress. Ford didn't have to pardon Nixon, and there were a lot of people around Ford who were urging him not to. In the end, Ford had more urgency about resolving this issue than anybody else around him. It was a Sunday morning. It was the 31st day of Ford's presidency. There had been no advance warning, and he went on television and announced that he was going to pardon Richard Nixon of any crimes that Nixon may have committed in office. Now, it's important to realize Nixon had not been indicted. He hadn't been convicted of anything. So this was a carte blanche absolution. Ford was hasty. He wasn't political enough in his thinking. He thought the American people would forgive him. And had Nixon been more apologetic, more contrite, they might have. But the weakness of Nixon's admission left Ford hanging out by himself. Gerald Ford was betrayed by Nixon. To me, this is the most tragic element. Nixon left office with a 25% approval rating. A month later, Ford had a 71% approval rating. When Ford announced the pardon, his approval plummeted virtually overnight to under 50%, and it never recovered. Gerald Ford tried harder probably than anybody to be a good president, but without the trust of the American people, that was too insurmountable a challenge. Ford's decision to pardon Nixon exemplifies leadership by demonstrating courage, by being a leader, by taking a courageous step, by allowing himself to be the person identified with this dramatic move. He was putting himself in a position where he was shadowed by ambiguity for the rest of his political career. And that's the tragedy. It took almost 25 years for people who had originally been very critical of the pardon to decide that it really was a courageous act in the best interest of the country. His legacy, unfortunately, is mixed. And I say unfortunately because he came into office with such promise and a deep appreciation for what the American people had been through and what it was going to take for them to heal. In light of how divided we are today, it's not hard to wish that he had been more successful as a president.